hopefully this week mark the end of one of the longest running infrastructure debates in this country, and that of course is the high-speed rail pipe dream. For over 40 years, Australian politicians and their government departments have spent millions on scoping studies and inquiries into this, trying in vain, it seems, to get the numbers to stack up. But that's the rub with an East Coast high-speed rail network. The costs just can't be justified. A new Grattan Insitute report reminds us that of all the high-speed rail networks around the world, only two are profitable. The rest remain heavily government subsidised, and more than this, the same report makes clear that any comparable 1,000-kilometre track abroad would service a population of at least 50 million. Now, the advocates of a Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne network would need to convince voters that Australia's population needs to double at least if their $100 billion vision is to be even marginally justifiable. Good luck with that. High-speed rail, that is the concept and the technology, well, that's not the problem here, despite what I've just said. I mean, I believe it has its place in Australia. The shortcomings of the vision to date, I think, has been scale. See, rather than dreaming of bullet trains whizzing people from Maroochydore to Melbourne, high-speed rail advocates, I think, would be better served pushing for shorter, sharper routes servicing the three big capitals. Now, to be frank, I doubt even these routes would be profitable. Of course, most public transport is not. But at least the taxpayer would get the infrastructure and the jobs without the expensive miles of tracks out past whoop-whoop servicing nothing and no one. Now, I know that people are pretty keen to build things, especially infrastructure, to get the economy going post-COVID-19. And I know coronavirus has made a lot of what seemed impossible yesterday seem plausible today. But the virus hasn't changed our geography. We're not Europe, we're not Japan. We're not China with megacities of 20 million. In other words, we're not suited to an eastern seaboard high-speed rail. All right, panel. Stephen, I'll bring you in first. Of course, the Labor leader, Anthony Albanese, is still pretty keen on high-speed rail, made that point a couple of weeks ago. What do you make of it?
No, look, I'm disappointed that you're so pessimistic. I think there's definitely a hunger for the people of Australia for high-speed rail. Most Australians, if you ask them, would you support it? They will overwhelmingly say yes. They believe the country needs it. I've spent a lot of time talking with Albo about it over the years. I've even been involved in a consortium here in Melbourne that has sought to put it and bring it to life. So I think some of your scepticism around a government-funded one absolutely is deserved, but there is more than one way to skin this cat, and there are more than one type of proposal which could see a high-speed East Coast rail link, as you've described, both viable and profitable ultimately. But it depends on willingness of governments to accept that it needs to be done using, and I hesitate to say this because, you know, Malcolm Turnbull, of course, invented the term, but value capture. So there are ways that this can be done that don't involve great licks of taxpayers' money.
Yes, perhaps that's right. Although, Daisy, value capture means, as I said in the piece, that you need to at least double the population. All of those people would end up on the eastern seaboard where almost everyone lives now. Stephen may well be right. If you ask the average punter, do you want high-speed rail, they'll say, yeah, sounds good. But if you also ask that same person, would you want it if it meant doubling the population of the eastern seaboard, I'm not sure they'd be so keen. What do you make of it?
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, I, for one, would love high-speed rail on the East Coast. I think it would be so good. You know, I live in Brisbane. I'm from Sydney originally. I spend time in Melbourne sometimes. I get so sick of aeroplanes, and they're so, I hate to sound like a greenie here, but, you know, they have so much pollution. I think it'd be such a good idea. So I'm disappointed to hear you lay out all those conditions, because it just makes sense. You know, of course we would need a bigger population in order for high-speed rail to actually be serviceable. It makes perfect sense when you look at the countries that do have it. You're right, they have massive populations. It would cost a huge amount of money, and of course would have to be heavily government subsidised. As Stephen said, you know, if there are other proposals, if there are other methods, then I would love to see them, because I think it is, in theory, a fantastic idea. But as you say, Michael, you know, why not start small? There's nothing wrong with starting small. You've got to build the foundations before you build the house. I think maybe smaller networks around the place would be good. I mean, anything to ease the property prices in the middle of cities, if you make it easier to commute from the outer suburbs, I mean, all systems go for that. So, hey, maybe starting small is the key to building up to it.
Tanveer, I mean, the point I suppose that I'm most against, it's not, as I said, it's not the technology of high-speed rail. I envisage something from, say, the Hunter through to Gosford in the Central Coast, through to Western Sydney, to take a New South Wales point of view. It does all those things, takes pressure off the Sydney property market, keeps Sydney, particularly Western Sydney, as the economic hub. I mean, to me, that makes sense. But this idea of someone hopping on a train in Brisbane en route to Melbourne, I just think is farcical. And then you think about the cost of a ticket, it would be so heavily subsidised, no one would take it.
Look, Michael, the proof's in the pudding. When governments put out this tender, there's plenty of offers to build it and get paid for it, but nobody wants to run it. Because as you say, we just don't have the population density to make it even remotely profitable. And even setting it up would cost something over $200 billion. So, yes, it sounds like a great idea, but when you put the expense and the opportunity cost, it's not... And the other thing about this, Michael, it's not actually just about transport. So one of the big underlying kind of justifications for high-speed rail was to kind of bring to life a lot of these regional towns. So I think we need to rethink that idea. I mean, the decentralisation is important. But, I mean, even with coronavirus now, with remote working, etc., you may well find it is easier to live in some of these regional towns. And then you have other policies by obviously having exceptional, say, national broadband, having great telecommunications, and also the government is improving visa incentives. So newly arrived immigrant, temporary skilled visas, students, even refugees, that they may have a bigger incentive to go to the smaller regional towns as well. So I think we need to think differently. A lot of the justification of high-speed rail wasn't just about getting, someone from Brisbane to Melbourne. It was really about decentralising some of the population and really kind of energising some of these regional towns. I don't think we need a train to do that.
No, you don't, but I mean, that's the point, isn't it, Stephen? I mean, short, sharp routes make sense, doesn't it? That does what Tanveer wants. Why does Labor insist we need this entire eastern seaboard connectivity?
Well, look, firstly, one of your arguments is the only way this can survive is if you have to double the population. The model that I'm talking about doesn't do that. It actually does what Tanveer says, which is you actually create centres outside of Melbourne and Sydney, where most of the population growth is taking place at the moment, and you make it attractive to be able to move in and out of Melbourne and Sydney from places that would normally at the moment by rail not be viable. And
but Stephen, who's going to buy all those new properties in regional centres? They're not going to be necessarily... I mean, you're saying everyone just leaves Sydney, Melbourne, goes and lives in Griffith.
No, I'm saying that you're able to make it attractive to live outside of Sydney and Melbourne. Now,
yeah, but you double the population.
I can name people... let me just finish. I can name people who've bought options on land on what they think the route between Sydney and Melbourne is right now. Because ultimately, the value capture concept is about flipping cheap rural land. If you know where the stations are, you then are able to build a station, not necessarily in a Ballarat or a Bendigo, because let me tell you, those towns don't want to double in size. So you've actually got to genuinely decentralise to some of the newer, less populated areas that are dying at the moment, and think this is a fabulous way for them to regenerate the life in their council area or their district. So it's not about having to bring in 25 million new people to Australia to make it work. It's about wanting to stop the growth in Sydney, wanting to stop the growth in Melbourne and move them out to areas that might only be 20 minutes by fast train and you're into the city. But it's not an area that's viable right now. So that's the one difference I'd say with how you've described it. It's got to double the population. No, that's not necessarily the way to do it.
And just to whoever wants to ask this one, I mean, it's one thing to talk about rail infrastructure in these regional areas that don't have people all of a sudden having 60,000 people, but it's only viable if they've got access to water. I mean, we've just come out of one of the worst droughts in the eastern seaboard. There's a reason, I think, why a lot of these places don't have many people living in them, because they're not very well serviced by, well, for example, water infrastructure.
The other thing, if I might throw just a little hypothetical out here for the group to have a little discussion. I mean, when you think of COVID-19 and the changes that has instigated, obviously with so many people working from home, I mean, when we go back to a world that is as normal as possible, I mean, it's feasible to assume that the working from home trend, certainly for some businesses, might continue. There might be some businesses and some companies who go, hey, this actually works. You know, if you want to work from home, you can. We might have an influx of less and less people, shall I say, actually leaving the house to commute anywhere. So, you know, if we say, even if we talk about starting small, whether it's high-speed rail or smaller rails, are we going to have to keep our eye out here for possibly less and less commuters? And in which case, you know, is it worthwhile investing so much if this happens in different rail networks?